Yes,
All right,
sir.
we're here with Leigh Travers, the executive chair of DigitalX. Welcome to Crypto Finder, Leigh.
Thanks for having me on, Fred.
All
Pleased to
right.
be here.
Do you want to tell us, tell us about your journey into crypto? How'd you get in?
I got in around 10 years ago, actually. Had a career in stockbroking and equities, and we had a client that was in Brazil and wanted to get his money, but transferring money from Australia to Brazil ended up taking over a week because funds were lost in between intermediary banks. And this was the time I was hearing about Bitcoin and how you could move money in 10 minutes, and I was pretty much instantly hooked. Bitcoin as the international payment layer and payment infrastructure, and that's when I moved out of financial services and got into crypto full time.
That's really cool. And did you invest? So that's at 2016. Is that when you started investing?
Yes, yeah, just a little bit earlier. I would say my investments were more still into equities that were exposed to Bitcoin. I saw Bitcoin not as digital gold when I first got in. Unfortunately, I saw Bitcoin as being that technology layer, the infrastructure layer. You obviously want to hold some Bitcoin, and that's when you want to be transferring assets. But I didn't initially jump onto Bitcoin as being the digital gold. That was probably closer to 2017 when we were seeing that sort of narrative play out more through Asia. And that's sort of where Bitcoin as being that long-term investment that you want to be making as digital gold sort of came through. And I think that's when a big group of investors sort of came through on the Bitcoin front, as well as were exposed to, some of the ICOs and some of the other elements that are happening in crypto.
When you say sort of equity investments exposed, I'll just take us back in time. What were things? What were things like that? What did the world look like?
Well, you couldn't look much further than DigitalX at the time, or Digital BTC. That was listed on the ASX as the first crypto company, originally a Bitcoin miner. And then it was, yeah, more private investments in companies that were exposed to Bitcoin mining or Bitcoin exchanges. They were the picks and shovels of the Bitcoin industry. There was a bunch of different altcoin mining investments you could have made as well. But yeah, predominantly in equities, I would say was where I was looking as an investor rather than, today's universe where the first thing you'd look is you'd be opening up CoinMarketCap or you'd be opening up CoinGecko and having a look at the tens of thousands of different tokens that are on offer. I guess now we have public markets as well, where the US does have a range of different equities you can get exposure to. But for many other markets like Australia, it's still really limited on the equity side, and I guess tokens proliferate.
And when you look back, you're buying equities versus buying, crypto today, and just thinking about those two things. Like, say you're buying an equity exposure or buying crypto exposure in Australia. Like, how would you describe that, and how has that changed over time?
I would say, from my perspective, I was involved in equities early on. I was a first job out of uni was a dealer's assistant, and we're investing in mining companies. So we went out there looking at buying some palladium or silver or gold. We were buying companies that were mining that. And I guess that was the approach that I took to crypto, right? You invest in the businesses that will be leveraging those crypto technologies rather than in the tokens themselves. Now that, thinking certainly changed over time, and I guess we've seen that broadly reflect across markets where at times you can see tokens have substantially more value than the equity businesses that they represent. So yeah, ebbs and flows in market cycles, and if you can time that well, you'll be doing extremely well. But I think for me, it's more about where the investment opportunities are at the time and where it makes sense, depending on if it's some personal capital or if it's capital you're deploying on behalf of an institution, venture capital firm. All these sort of frameworks are very different depending on who the investor is.
There's obviously been, since 2016, that would mean that you've kind of seen the 2017, 2021, and 2020, maybe call it 2025 rallies and falls.
Mm.
How have you handled those, and what's been your experience throughout that.
Yeah, I mean it's been a volatile industry, but I guess similar to investing in early stage tech companies, early stage miners, these have all got sort of peaks and troughs, and crypto certainly had that. In terms of how you think about things, well, one is leverage, like try to avoid leverage as much as possible. Invest in projects you think will be there for the longer term because there's not always strong liquidity in these projects. And then, yeah, from a diversification point of view, I think that's certainly been important for those that have been in the industry long term. And finally, Bitcoin is the major. That is the blue chip. That's the one to have the majority of your assets in. Is sort of the way that I've been looking at the market. And yeah, I think that's sort of served me better than other strategies.
Would you go back?
Would I go back? I would say into specific niches of financial services, yes. But from where my previous sort of experience was, which was moving more towards financial planning, general advice, I didn't find that had like the level of interest and excitement that I wanted from a technology and asset class that has grown as fast as what crypto and Bitcoin has. So absolutely no regrets. And would I look at financial services from particular niches? Yeah, absolutely. And I think I've been doing that over the last few years too.
Now, DigitalX is kind of like one of the OGs. You were talking about like mining Bitcoin back in the days. That's a big deal, quite an orchestration as well. It's also one of the largest listed Bitcoin treasury companies in Australia. Can you tell us about that and what is your view on treasury companies?
Yeah, so from a DigitalX perspective, the Bitcoin treasury move was made in mid 2025, and that was made with a number of other global investors in Animoca, Parify, UTXO, which are heavy investors into the meta planets of the world, Nakamoto's, etc. And the view was, there's an opportunity there to build up something that may be like MicroStrategy. Certainly not at that scale, but certainly to provide a company, an ASX company that would be accumulating Bitcoin over time. So investors could come in, invest in a company today, knowing it has a certain number of Bitcoin and see that grow over time. That strategy has been relatively short-lived. It became quite difficult to accretively raise capital. So raising capital without diluting the current shareholders towards their Bitcoin was a big challenge. And it's a real scale game. So offering products like perpetual preferreds, offering products like convertible notes with near zero interest rates, etc., are really only available to market caps of certain size. The other element would have been to get the passive buying from index funds. Again, you really need to build up the market cap of a public company quite quickly to generate access to that. And that became quite difficult for us. So, in terms of our strategy to accumulate, the 2100 Bitcoin, etc., that's something that we have paused. We certainly have the largest number of Bitcoin on the balance sheet in Australia. We are bullish on Bitcoin, but we also wanted to pursue an M&A strategy. We've seen valuations across the tech sector, across the blockchain and crypto sectors fall markedly, and I think we're in a really good position relative to other, heavily leveraged peers that are forced sellers at these sort of levels that don't have dry powder, that do have a big, I guess, annual burn on operational expenditure. We don't have those things. So I think an M&A strategy for DigitalX makes sense. For country leaders like MicroStrategy and MetaPlanet, I think they still have some really strong futures there to be able to build that out. But for smaller caps, it's really difficult, like
Mm.
extremely difficult. And that's not even moving into some of the altcoins that have very little yield generation. It gets just tougher and tougher as you move down the risk curve to become a treasury company and grow to that size that we talked about. So, yeah, excited where DigitalX's strategy is today is having the largest Bitcoin balance sheet on the ASX, as well as pursuing M&A in an environment where investments in the sectors that we're looking at are certainly trading at reduced values.
Yeah, as you were saying, you're obviously looking to deploy capital and you're finding opportunities. What sort of main narratives do you find interesting right now?
Well, of course, we'd love to get a piece of the AI pie. Like we're seeing just the massive migration from software, from apps, from everything we used to use, just to using our own AI agents, to using our own AI products. And that's something that we're looking at. Obviously, we don't have the balance sheet to create large language models, but we do see there's opportunities in businesses that are integrating AI. So we are looking at, I would say, regulated businesses that either have proprietary data or have a very strong incentive to use technology to manage their regulatory obligations. So that's, financial services is a big one. And that also lends itself to industries like compliance technology or reg tech. We know blockchain can certainly be used there as well. We're also seeing, with the geopolitics and some of the issues we're seeing offshore, localization now is becoming quite important. So supply chains are being impacted. So anything to do with supply chain management, we think technology businesses within that space are really attractive. Looking at businesses like WiseTech, for example, just as an example of an industry, their retention in terms of their client base is above 100%. So that tells you an environment where investors are worried about switching out of technology. You've got a client base that's literally spending more than they spent last year, and you're bringing on new clients as well. So we think there's still a huge growth for the right type of technology businesses and the right type of technology products. And we're looking into where AI is going to assist those businesses. We're looking into where, regulatory moats or data moats mean that this technology is not going away. And even so far as potentially within the industry of energy, heavily regulated, we're seeing just a tremendous demand because of AI, because of EV. So we're looking across that too, and just getting a ton of deal flow across the Bitcoin, blockchain, and crypto sectors too, that we think might be really interesting for DigitalX.
In terms of, you've seen a lot of history in investing, and what would you say would be your single biggest lesson you could share with, crypto investors or founders that, you see that they really should take notice of?
Hmm. I've had a few lessons over the years. I would say can't just trust, you also have to verify. So there's a lot of claims that get made, particularly if you're not speaking to founders on a frequent basis. Really important you go and check those with third parties and you do your due diligence. That's probably a key one. Another one would be that, I think selling at times when the market is euphoric is rational. We don't need to hodl forever. Probably from the crypto perspective is what we've seen there. We've seen some tremendous gains and then also some pretty serious declines as well. So selling when the market is euphoric is pretty important. But yeah, that sort of founder trust and verification, and then just being, I would say, more nimble on the sell side is probably the two biggest lessons that I've had.
That's great. Great lessons. And in terms of um, you had a lot of experience with Animoca. Animoca are really real big pioneers of NFTs. What are your views now on sort of NFTs?
Yeah, I think NFTs have had a huge amount of interest, from that 2021 period. And it was more of something you'd want to be associated with. It's a community, it's an image, it's a brand, and that was almost like a membership style investment. And I think that sort of thesis is falling away in terms of that sort of value that can be generated, as well as like the fine art perspective. So I would say my view is probably bearish as an asset to hold value for, but bullish from a technology layer in terms of being able to prove that assets are anti-counterfeit or being able to prove the provenance. So it's almost like you're paying for a security wrapper, and that's the real value behind NFTs. I certainly can be persuaded otherwise at times, but that's kind of how I'm seeing things at the moment. It's really more of a tool than it is like an investable asset class for most. Um, and yeah, the interest levels are as low as they've been since pre-2021 in the markets now for anyone that hasn't checked the prices in the last 12 months or so.
I guess, and finally, in terms of Bitcoin, we've had a few speculations about where we're at. Where do you think we are in the cycle? And I guess in terms of where do you think we're going to be with Bitcoin's price at the end of the year?
I think it's a little bit too short term to predict. I think we're going to have a lot of volatility between now and the end of the year. It's probably been a little bit too short of a period between the most recent highs that we saw at 125 to sort of call we'd be coming back there by the end of the year. I think we're going to have to spend some time between here and those highs over that period. That's been the history of Bitcoin. It takes a lot longer than what we've had to recover. We know that we've seen a significant amount of selling from some of the OG holders over that high period, and that selling has actually sort of slowed down over the last 2 to 3 months. So I don't think from a lows perspective we'll be able to go much lower. I think there's quite a degree of buying support here. Um, I think it's certainly great value here, but I don't suspect there's going to be a huge jump back to all-time highs in the coming short period.
Amazing. Leigh Travers, Executive Chair of DigitalX, thank you so much. Some really good insights there. Really appreciate all those investing tips and some really strong ones there. And also, best of luck in deploying all that into the markets right now.
Thanks, Fred. Really appreciate it. Yeah, we've got around $30 million earmarked for investments and looking to move from that M&A strategy.
Wonderful. And where should everyone contact you, Leigh?
Email's best, lee@digitalx.com, or I'm active on LinkedIn and X.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us, Leigh.
Thanks, Fred. Appreciate it.